Welcome to Permission to Breathe, a transformative podcast dedicated to providing a safe space where you can inhale deeply and exhale freely while embracing your grief journey unapologetically. I am your host, Dr. T.I.M, a spiritual practitioner, grief advocate and educator, author, and your guide on this journey through grief. This space was born out of the understanding that grief is not just an event, it's a lifelong unfolding. It's layered, it's complex, and often it's silence. And here is where we disrupt the silence. We will talk about the grief that lingers after the food stops arriving at your door, the grief that remains when no one calls and no one comes by to check on you, the grief that's complicated, the grief that's ancestral, the grief that lives in your body long before it ever reaches your tears. Every episode, we honor the humanity of grief, the anger, the confusion, the numbness, the longing, and we do so without apology. Whether you're navigating fresh loss, unspoken sorrow, or the weight of a world that just won't pause, this podcast invites you to sit down, breathe deeply, and give yourself the permission you've been waiting for to grieve, to feel, to breathe. Let's begin. Today's episode is sponsored by Let the Church Grieve by Dr. T.I.M, a compelling book that explores the often overlooked subject of grief within spiritual communities. Dr. Isaac combines personal antidotes with theological insights, providing a compassionate framework for understanding and addressing grief collectively. This book emphasizes the need for spiritual leaders to create safe spaces for mourning and guides congregations through the grieving process with faith and empathy. It's a must-read for anyone looking to support those experiencing grief within their spiritual communities. Grab your copy of Let the Church Grieve at www.drtammyisaac.com today and begin the journey towards healing and growth. When we talk about healing, we are often talking about the work that begins after something has been lost, wounded, or carried for too long. In this conversation, when we talk about healing, we are talking about healing that becomes necessary because grief has touched our lives. Grief is not only about death, but grief is about loss in all the ways loss can show up in a human life. For many women, grief has taken many forms. Grief from relationships that broke our trust, grief from expectations placed on us before we were ready to carry them, grief from being the dependable one, the strong one, the one who keeps everything moving while quietly feeling the weight of it all. And for many women, that grief did not begin with us. There are women in our family lines who carried enormous responsibilities, women who endured loss without the space to process it, women who had to keep working, keep mothering, keep showing up even while grieving. Their grief was real, but many of them did not have the permission, the language, or the support to tend to it fully. So what happens to grief that has nowhere to go? It does not simply disappear. It settles into families. It shapes expectations and it influences how women learn to survive, how we relate to love, how we handle stress, and sometimes even how comfortable we feel resting. That is why when a woman begins to heal, something larger is happening. She is not only addressing her own grief, she is interrupting patterns that may have moved quietly through generations. She is learning to feel what others had to suppress. She is learning to speak what others had to keep silent. She is learning to care for herself in ways that were not always possible for the woman before her. That is why healing as a woman is not small work. It is grief work, and it is historical work. Today, we're going to explore what that means, how grief shows up in the lives of women, and why the act of healing may be one of the most powerful ways women change the story of themselves and for the generations that follow. So wherever you are listening from today, I want you to take a deep breath with me. Because sometimes the work of healing begins the moment we finally acknowledge the grief we have been carrying all our lives. Now that we've named the idea that healing as a woman is historical work, we have to talk about where that history actually lives. History does not only live in textbooks, right? History lives in bodies, in families. History lives in expectations that get passed down quietly from one generation to the next. Many women were raised watching other women carry enormous emotional responsibility. We watch mothers, grandmothers, aunties, and caregivers hold entire households together. They worked, nurtured, prayed, solved problems, and made sacrifices that were often never fully acknowledged. But behind that strength was often grief. Some of these women carried grief from losing loved ones. Some carried grief from opportunities that were never available to them. Some even carried grief from relationships that required endurance instead of mutual care. Then there were some that carried grief from living in systems that demanded their labor but did not always honor their humanity. And because survival was the priority, grief was often pushed aside. It was not always safe to stop and to feel. It was not always possible to slow down long enough to process loss. Life had to keep moving. Children had to be raised. Bills had to be paid. Communities had to function. So grief was often carried quietly. What happens when grief is carried quietly for years, sometimes decades? It shapes how people learn to live. Women learn to keep going even when they were exhausted. They learn to prioritize everyone else's need. They learn to endure disappointment without making space to grieve. They learn to push through emotional pain in order to keep their family stable. That kind of endurance can look like strength from the outside. But inside, many women were carrying grief that never had the chance to be acknowledged. And when grief is not acknowledged, it does not simply disappear. It influences how we show up in the world. It can and has shaped how safe we feel expressing our needs. It can shape how comfortable we feel receiving help. And it can shape how we understand love, boundaries, and rest. So when we say healing as a woman is historical work, we are acknowledging something very important. The grief women are healing today is not always only about one event. It is often connected to patterns, expectations, and emotional burdens that have existed for a very long time. And when a woman begins to recognize that grief and tend to it with honesty and care, she is not only changing her own life, she is changing the emotional story that follows her. As we continue this conversation about healing as historical work, we also have to talk about something many women know very well: the identity of being the strong one. Somewhere along the way, many women learned that strength meant endurance. Strength meant showing up no matter how tired you were. And strength meant holding your emotions together so everyone else could feel safe. For some women, that expectation started very early in life. You might have been the child who matured quickly, the one who helped take care of the siblings, the one who noticed the adults were overwhelmed and stepped in without being asked. You became responsible long before you were ready. And that kind of early responsibility often comes with grief. Grief for the childhood that moved too quickly, grief for the moments when you needed support but became the support instead, and grief for the emotional space that you did not have. As women grow older, that identity of being the strong one can follow them into every area of their lives. In families, they become the problem solver. In friendships, they become the listener. In workplaces, they then become the dependable one. And in churches and communities, they become the one who shows up for everyone else. And from the outside, this looks admirable. People praise it. They describe these women as reliable, capable, and resilient. But underneath that strength, underneath that capability, underneath that reliability, underneath that resilience, many women are carrying quiet grief. Grief from always being the one who holds things together, from being asked from rarely being asked what they need, right? Grief from feeling like vulnerability might disrupt the stability others depend on her for. And over time, something else then can happen. A woman may begin to believe that her value comes from how much she can carry. So she keeps pushing forward. She keeps producing. She keeps supporting everyone. And the grief she carries get pushed further into the background. But the body remembers. The nervous system feels the strain of always being responsible, always being available, always being composed. This is why healing work can feel so unfamiliar for so many women. Healing ask us a different question, right? Instead of asking how much can you handle, healing asks, what have you been carrying that deserves to be acknowledged? And sometimes the first step in healing is simply admitting that being the strong one came with a cost. That cost is often grief. Grief for the parts of ourselves that had to be set aside in order to survive. By now, we can begin to see something clearly. What the world often praises in women as strength is sometimes just survival. Survival is what happens when life requires you to keep going even when you are hurting. It is the ability to function while carrying grief, the ability to adapt to pressure, responsibility, and emotional weight. Many women become very skilled at survival. They keep the household running. They show up at work and perform well. They support friends and family members. They stay dependable even when their own emotional needs have not been met. From the outside, survival can look like stability. But survival does not always mean that grief has been processed. Sometimes survival means grief has simply been postponed. Women learn to keep moving because life does not always pause long enough for them to sit with what they have lost. Relationships change, expectations grow, and responsibilities increase. And the pace of life can make it difficult to stop and acknowledge what the heart has been carrying. So grief can remain present beneath the surface. It might show up as exhaustion that does not go away with rest. It might show up as irritability that seems to appear without warning. And it might show up as emotional numbness where feelings feel distant or even muted. And sometimes women realize that they have been surviving for so long that they do not remember what it feels like to slow down emotionally. And this is where healing begins to look different for survival. Survival asks one question: how do I keep going? And healing asks a different question: what has this life required of me? And what grief have I been carrying because of it? When a woman begins to ask that question honestly, she begins to step out of survival mode. She begins to notice the grief she has been holding, the grief connected to sacrifices that she made, the grief connected to roles she stepped into, and the grief connected to losses that were never fully acknowledged. That moment of awareness can feel uncomfortable at first, because healing, it invites us to pause long enough to feel what survival asked us to ignore. But that pause is always where change begins. It is where grief finally begins to move instead of remaining stored inside of our bodies. Once a woman begins to recognize the grief she has been carrying, the next question becomes very real. What does healing actually look like? So for many people, healing is just imagined as the moment when pain finally disappears, as if one day the grief is gone, the past will no longer matter, and life simply moves forward without any trace of what happened. But grief rarely works that way. Healing does not erase what was lost. Healing does not pretend the past did not shape us. Healing is the process of learning how to live with grief in a way that does not control every part of our lives. For many women, this is unfamiliar territory because survival often required pushing feelings aside, ignoring emotional needs, and staying focused on responsibilities. And many women were taught directly or indirectly that pausing to feel grief might slow everything down. So when healing begins, it feels very strange. Healing might look like allowing yourself to acknowledge losses that were never named before. It might look like admitting that something hurt more than you allowed yourself to recognize at the time. Healing might also look like setting boundaries where none existed before. A woman who begins healing may start to recognize that she has been overextending herself emotionally. She may even begin to notice how often she takes care of everyone else while neglecting her own needs. And that awareness can bring grief with it alone, right? Grief for years spent giving more than she had. She could experience grief for relationships where care was not mutual, and grief for the ways she learned to survive rather than to be supported. But this is also where something important begins to happen. Healing gives grief somewhere to move. Instead of staying buried beneath responsibility or silence, grief begins to be acknowledged. And it can be spoken, it can be reflected on, and it can be processed with honesty and compassion. And as that begins to happen, women often begin to experience something they may not have felt in a long time. And that's space. Space to breathe, space to rest, space to feel emotions without immediately pushing them aside. That space is not weakness. That space is where healing takes root. As healing begins to take root, something important starts to shift. A woman begins to recognize that the grief she has been carrying does not have to define the rest of her life. It is part of her story, but it is not the only chapter. This is where healing starts to move beyond survival and into transformation. When a woman begins to acknowledge her grief, she often begins to make different choices. She may begin to notice patterns that she once accepted as normal. Patterns in relationships, patterns in how much she gives, patterns in how little she asks for in return. And this healing, it helps women see those patterns clearly. And once something is seen clearly, it becomes possible to choose something different. A woman who is Healing may begin to set boundaries that protect her emotional well-being. She may begin to recognize that being constantly exhausted is not a badge of honor. She may begin to understand that love does not have to come at the expense of her peace. These choices may seem small from the outside, but they are powerful. Because when a woman begins to make these shifts, the emotional environment around her also begins to change. Children may witness a different model of care. Friends may experience a different level of honesty, and families may begin to see that emotional needs matter and that grief deserves attention. In this way, healing does not stay contained within one person. It influences the relationships around her. It shapes how the next generation understands emotional life. It creates space where silence once existed. And this is why healing as a woman can truly be described as historical work. History is not only written in public movements or major events. History is also written in the quiet decisions people make inside their daily lives. When a woman decides to acknowledge her grief, to care for herself, and to live with greater emotional honesty, she is helping to change the story that continues after her. And that kind of change often begins with something very simple: the willingness to face grief with compassion rather than silence. Something many women do not expect is that healing can make grief more visible. When life has required you to keep moving, grief often stays in the background. Responsibilities take priority: work, caregiving, family needs, and daily survival can leave very little room to slow down and feel what has been carried for years. But when a woman begins to heal, the pace sometimes changes. She may start reflecting on her life in ways that she didn't before, and she may begin noticing losses she pushed past at that time. And she may even begin to recognize how much emotional weight she has been holding. And with that awareness, grief can become more present. This does not mean healing is failing. In many ways, it just means that healing is beginning, because grief that was once buried is finally being acknowledged. A woman may feel herself grieving things she never fully named before. She may grieve the girl she once was and the responsibilities she carried too early. She may grieve relationships where her needs were overlooked. She may even grieve the years she spent believing she had to earn rest, love, or acceptance. And sometimes women also grieve what they did not receive: the support they needed, the encouragement that they hoped for, the emotional safety that would have allowed them to feel more freely. These realizations can bring a mixture of emotions. There can be sadness, but also clarity. There can be disappointment, but also a relief. And because naming grief allows it to move instead of remaining unspoken. And this is where healing begins to deepen. When grief is acknowledged with honesty, it often becomes easier to respond to ourselves with compassion instead of judging the ways we survived. We begin to understand them. We see the younger version of ourselves with greater gentleness, and we recognize the effort it took to keep going. And we begin to allow ourselves the care that may have been missing before. Remember, healing does not erase grief, but it changes how we live with it. Instead of carrying it silently, we begin to face it with awareness, support, and understanding. And that shift can open the door to a different way of living. As we come toward the end of this conversation, I want to bring us back to the heart of today's episode: healing as a woman is historical work. When we hear the words women's history, many of us think about famous names, women who led movements, broke barriers, or changed laws. Those stories matter and they deserve to be remembered, but history is also shaped in quieter ways. History is shaped in homes, history is shaped in families, and history is shaped in the daily decisions women make about how they live, how they love, and how they care for themselves. When a woman decides to face her grief instead of burying it, something important happens. She begins to live with greater honesty. She may begin to speak about emotions that were once avoided. She may begin to allow herself rest without exhaustion that once felt normal. She may begin to expect relationships that include mutual care instead of one-sided responsibility. These choices may not make headlines, but they matter deeply because the emotional environment around her begins to shift. Children grow up seeing a different model of emotional lives, and friends experience a different level of openness. And families, hey, they begin to see that grief can be acknowledged rather than hidden. In this way, healing becomes something larger than one individual experience. It becomes part of a continuing story. Each woman who chooses healing is helping to reshape how grief is handled, how emotions are understood, and how care is given in the generations that follow. And that means something important for the woman listening right now, or the women in your life that you will share this episode with or tell about. You are not just observing history. You are a part of it. The way you care for yourself, the way you face grief, the way you allow healing to take place in your life, all of that contributes to the story that continues after you. And that story has the power to look different from the ones that came before. Thank you so much for joining me today on the Permission to Breathe podcast. I want to invite you to sit with it just a little bit longer. Notice what came up, notice what feels heavy and what feels clear, and know that there's no rush to resolve any of it. You can also read the companion blog to this episode found on my website at www.drtammyisaac.com along with the show notes. If this conversation was helpful, you are welcome to share it with someone who may need it or leave a review so others can find their way here. And join me next Monday for a new episode of the Permission to Breathe podcast. And as always, take care of yourself gently. And until next time, give yourself permission to breathe.